Yes, so I work as an assistant professor in the section of clinical developmental psychology, and in this presentation, I'd like to tell you a bit about the work we've been doing looking at the importance of peer interactions and mainly the broader social context when studying adolescent development and also within schools. So if we think about adolescence, or you think about when you yourself were an adolescent, you might remember it as being a period of a lot of change, but also opportunities, a time when your priorities shift, and perhaps when the drives or the things you found important are different to what you would list if I asked you that now. And I think this picture illustrates it quite nicely, is that you could be next to one of the most famous paintings in the world. So this is the Night Watch in the Rijksmuseum. But if you're an adolescent, that painting might not be so important, and actually the interactions you can have with your peers on your phone might actually be much more interesting to you. And I think this nicely illustrates kind of the different aspects driving adolescent behavior. So if we see adolescence as a transition period, we know that there are these obvious biological and physical changes, but also a lot of behavioral change. And some of this will be in the cognitive domain. So then we're thinking about the development of executive functions, self-regulation, goal-directed behavior, some of the things that actually Simona touched on in the first presentation during childhood. And we see continued refinement of these abilities during the adolescent period. But this happens alongside a lot of social change. So the social environment becomes much more important. There's this shift away from parents and the family unit towards looking much more towards peers as a developmental context. And also the continued development of social cognitive skills are also important determinants. And then lastly, we have the more socio-emotional development. So here we can think about things like the increase in risk-taking that we see during adolescence, also as a result of this increased sensitivity to reward. And all of these different components are interacting together. And what we've really been looking at is how can we try to study these together. So not just zoom in on, for example, cognitive development, but consider cognitive development within the context of the social and emotional changes that are happening. So as I said, we've been looking at how adolescents then adapt also their social, emotional and their cognitive behavior to the demands of their social environment and how this is informing their development. And there are sort of, I mean, obviously there's lots of ways you can measure this social influence. And in this presentation, I want to touch on focus on two and say a little bit about one, which are methods that we've been using in our research to try to incorporate the social context more into the studies we've been doing. The first way we've been doing this is by looking at classroom norms, or more specifically implicit classroom norms, where we've been looking at behavior within a class, average behavior in a class, and how that can influence subsequent development at an individual level. And I'll be showing you an example of that in a minute. Another example of a way that this can be done is using peer nomination data. And this is quite an intensive method data collection wise. So it means we go into classrooms, we try to get all the kids in the class to participate, and we ask them all questions about their social relationships and also about each other. So it means it can be quite sensitive data, so we have to handle that accordingly. But we could ask them questions like, who are your friends in your class? Who do you like? Who do you dislike? Perhaps who is popular, who is less popular? I'm sure many of you are familiar with these methods. And this we can then use, for example, for social network analysis. So this is the middle example you see in the pictures here, where every child in a class becomes a node in a network, and we can map or graph all the connections between them and look at network measures such as how central a child is in the network, what their influence is, but also how similar they are to people who are close to them in the network. I won't be talking about that so much today, but if anyone has any questions, always happy to chat about that later. And the third is something a bit more experimental, where we've been trying to really integrate the social context directly into an experimental task. So here you see two pictures of Miriam, one of my PhD students who's actually been doing a lot of this work. And this is to represent the pictures that we took of actual participants, which we then implemented in a task as social feedback. And that's the second example I'll be telling you about later. So as I said, there are two studies I want to touch upon today. The first looks specifically at how classroom behavioral norms and also levels of social support affected subsequent development or continued development of executive functions during adolescence. And this is something that I've also worked on with Mariette Huizingha, also in this session. And the second is how peer feedback, so this peer feedback from actual peers within the class, can influence adolescent cognitive control, and looking at that in experimental design, which is a paper that Miriam has published recently. So to move on to the first study, so here we were very much focusing on how these behavioral norms in a classroom with regards to levels of executive function could influence subsequent development. And this research was informed partially by research sort of connected to what Simona was talking about, how we see that executive function development during childhood, most of this work has been done in childhood, seems to be influenced by the social environment. And that can happen in different ways, both through modeling of behaviors, so seeing classmates behave in a certain way and then behaving in that way yourself. But it can also occur through social relationships, where children in the class may be more or less accepting of behavior that is similar to the classroom norm. So a child, for example, who is very loud in the class or can't sit still while the other children can, may have negative social interactions as a result of that, which may then also lead them to modify their own behaviors. And this is sort of this behavioral modeling within these social relationships. And although we know that adolescence is a period that's characterized by a lot of social change and where these social relationships are really important, we actually don't know that much about how this affects the development of executive functions. So in this study, we wanted to use longitudinal data to look at how executive functions develop over time within these social constructs. So in this data set, we had a group of about 400 adolescents who participated twice in the study. The first time was during the first year of secondary school, so these were Dutch adolescents, and then again a year later. By the time when they were tested the first time, they'd been in the class they were in for a couple of months. So we presumed that these behavioral norms had been established and that they'd been able to identify them. And then we looked a year later to see how their behavior had changed. And executive functions here were measured using the brief, so the behavior rating inventory of executive function, and specifically 3 subscales, namely an inhibition subscale, a cognitive flexibility subscale, and an emotional control subscale. So those were the 3 things we were looking at executive function wise. And then we also examined social support, both from classmates and from teachers, using the Harter social support scale. And we analyzed this using multi-level models, but rather than showing you the tables, I've made a more visual representation of it here. So in looking at this development of executive function, we first started with the classroom norms at time 1. So when they were in the first year of secondary school, we calculated classroom norms, so average levels of behavior in the class for inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and control, cognitive flexibility and emotion regulation, which is what you see here on the left. And then we use this to predict individual levels of these executive functions, namely again, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and emotion regulation at time point 2, so 1 year later. And all these analyses were controlled for gender and for the individual levels of executive function at time 1. So if we look at how these predict each other, we found that the classroom norm for inhibition and for emotion regulation were both significant predictors of change, positive change in executive functions 1 year later. So classroom norms for inhibition at T1 predicted individual levels of inhibition at T2, and the same for emotion regulation, where higher levels of inhibition in the class were also predictive of higher individual inhibition a year later. The relationship between cognitive flexibility at a classroom and individual level was non-significant, and we have a few explanations for this that I'll look at with you in a minute. First, just to shortly touch on the effects of social support. So here we used individually perceived, so individual levels of classmate support. So each child reported on how supportive they found their classmates to be. And then we used the class mean for teacher support. So how the class as a whole, how supportive they found their teacher. And again, to see if these then predicted executive function a year later. And here we found these relationships to be non-significant. So in our study, social support was not predictive of any change in executive functions. So from this study, where we've been looking at how these behavioral norms can influence subsequent executive function development, we see that both inhibition and emotion regulation seem to change as a result of classroom norms. And we think the reason that we may find this for inhibition and emotion regulation and not for cognitive flexibility is that these may be more overt forms of behavior. So inhibition and emotion regulation, the type of behaviors contained in those scales, are very much behaviors that other classmates would be able to observe and perhaps would also respond to in a positive or negative way if a child behaves in a way that doesn't fit within the behavioral norm. Cognitive flexibility may be a more individual behavior that impacts the child themselves, if they have difficulties with that, but maybe something that is less obvious to other classmates, and also something that, because it's more difficult to observe, it's also more difficult to learn from through modeling. But we think that the fact that these overt behaviors also or do seem to influence development could be of interest for potential interventions, because it means that if you are looking at changing this at a classroom level, by changing behavior in the whole class rather than focusing just on the children who may be having executive function difficulties, you could improve things across the board rather than focusing on just the children who seem to be having problems. And for social support, I don't really want to go into that too much now, but in short, it just seems that this effect may be different for adolescents than it is for children, where the role of social support does seem to be bigger. Because I want to take some time just to show you the second example of the way in which we've been integrating the social context. And here we've been looking and focusing on the effect of social rewards on cognitive control. And just to give you a bit of background, there's been some previous work, such as this study by Coles and colleagues, where they've looked at the effects of rewards on inhibitory control. And most inhibitory control tasks look at false alarm rates. So that tells you how many inhibition errors people make on a task. And they've shown that by attaching rewards to these types of cognitive control tasks, we see that performance can improve. So here they had a social reward condition and a non-social reward condition, and the non-social reward condition was points or money. And they looked at the number of false alarms during a baseline, so without a reward, and then the number of false alarms during these reward conditions. And we see in this graph that all types of rewards seem to decrease false alarms, suggesting that the motivational context is very important for cognitive control. And we were interested in seeing whether this social reward, whether that's a general effect or whether these social rewards are dependent on who actually you are receiving the social reward from. And we looked at this in a group of young adolescents who were about 13 and late adolescents who were around 17. And again, we did data collection in schools where we used peer nominations to determine who do these children like in their class and who do they dislike. So this is where we're trying to bring the social context in by actually looking at which classmates do you like, which classmates do you dislike, so that we can use those classmates as feedback in the task. And we use that to build individual versions of a go, no-go task, which you see here. And a go, no-go task is a task where you are asked to push a button when you see a letter, so in this task an A or a B, and to not push a button when you see a no-go stimulus, in this task an X. And an X appears less frequently, so the idea is that people build up a prepotent response to respond to the letter, and then occasionally they have to inhibit this response, and that sometimes they're able to and sometimes they're not, and that can be an index of cognitive control. And we attach this to a reward condition where we gave them feedback. And this was social feedback from either someone they liked or someone they disliked. So they saw actual pictures, if they correctly inhibited their performance, of a smiling peer, and if they were incorrect, a neutral face of a peer. And this was either someone they liked or they disliked. And then we had a control condition with non-social feedback, just telling them whether their response was correct or incorrect, with a green or red picture. So here we're trying to show them actual pictures of their classmates to provide the feedback on whether their response was correct or incorrect. And because I see that we're running a bit low on time, I'm going to go through this a bit more quickly. And what we saw in this study is that if we looked at D prime, which is a measure of performance, so which accounts for response bias, we saw an age effect. So the dark line that you see at the top is the late adolescent group, and this one here is the early adolescent group. So although we see a strong difference in that the older adolescents perform better than the younger adolescents, we didn't see a difference across conditions. So our feedback condition doesn't seem to have affected behavior or the cognitive control if we look at performance. However, we did find a strong effect on reaction times. And here we see that reaction times become significantly slower in the liked condition. So it seems that when they see a picture of the person that they like, they become more cautious, and they're trying to perhaps perform better on the task, or at least more carefully in a more considered way, to receive that feedback from their liked peer. So although we didn't find the effects on the cognitive control measure, we do think that this suggests that it's worth looking into finding ways to perhaps refine these individual tasks more, to examine this in more detail. So to conclude, we've been using these different paradigms to look at the ways that the social context influences adolescent development, and the way social feedback may influence social reward processing, and how social learning processes, which are very important during adolescence, help them to flexibly adapt their behavior to the environment. And basically, I think the main message is that it's important to consider this social context, because it seems to impact development in different ways. And if we only focus on, for example, cognitive development, without looking at the social, without looking at what's happening in the classroom, I think we're missing a lot of what's happening. So thank you for your attention. Thank you to my collaborators. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.